Howdy, and welcome to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. The Preaching Poetry Podcast uses poetry to inspire conversation and to rediscover the world. Let's get to it. Howdy, y'all. Welcome to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. It's good to be with you here today. We have a special guest with us today. Sean, say hi.
Howdy.
Nice to have you with us. Sean, really excited about this. You've been a big fan and supporter of the podcast from the beginning. And so I knew I had to have you on, and you picked an awesome poem that we'll get into here in a little bit today. But, before we get too far into it, I just wanted to ask, I guess first, I know why you started listening to the podcast. You're a good man, a good friend. When a buddy of yours is going to have a podcast, you're like, okay, I guess I'll give it a shot. We'll see. We'll give it a try. But you kept listening, and you actually seemed to enjoy it. So tell me, what is it about the Preaching Poetry Podcast that has kept you listening to it?
Well, you're right. The first time you listen to it, it's like, all right, Robbie's doing something. I like Robbie. I'll give it a shot.
Thank you.
But what kept me around was in part the intellectual debates that you set up almost with yourself in the course of discussing the poems, where you lay out a position that someone could have on this poem, and in a lot of cases I was familiar with the poems, and then I would get into that argument, and then you lay out why that criticism might be true or might not be, and it really got me engaged, and sometimes I even hopped on and kind of responded with, no, I still don't agree, but I was very engaged with it, and I loved having my brain worked that way, but the other thing was that I was also just learning a lot about poets that I would have said, yeah, I know who that guy is, or I know what that poem is. But I was learning a lot more about the background, and I really enjoyed that.
Well, awesome. It's really good to hear. So tell me, Sean, I know it's hard to choose. It's like choosing a favorite child. Or maybe that's just for me. But what is your favorite episode and why?
I understand I have nieces, so you feel the same way. And I loved Old Ironsides, but my favorite absolutely was If, because there were so many of those great controversial moments to unpack in the poem, and I felt like you did that really well, so I enjoyed that.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It's one of my favorites, too. I guess they're all one of my favorites. But then, so is this poem that we're going to do today. Sean, you picked this one out, and I'm really glad that you did this one. It's a poem called Christmas Bells by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So Sean, we're going to give you the honor today of reading the poem. So why don't you do that for us?
All right. I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat, of peace on earth, goodwill to men, and thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men, till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice, a chime, a chant sublime, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then from each black accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent, and made forlorn the households born, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men.
Awesome. Thank you, Sean. So we'll talk about sort of the structure of the poem here in a minute. Before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about Longfellow himself, and I want to kind of put this poem in context. So this poem was written in 1863. Sean, can you tell us what was happening in the United States in the year 1863?
There were a few important things, but the big one, which you may be aware of, is the Civil War. And specifically, one of the most famous battles, Gettysburg, had just concluded about a month before. and it was still a few months before Ulysses S. Grant would take over. So right now we still have some generals of questionable quality running things on the northern side, and the war is very much not decided at this point.
Yeah, we look at it with hindsight, so we already know the timeline, and we can sort of draw the bell curve and talk about when the war was really won, and we kind of know that Gettysburg is that turning point now. But like you said, you still have some less than able military command going on right now, and so we may look at it and say, oh, well, it's a done deal. Yeah, we should be looking forward to the end of this thing soon. But people living through it would not have been quite so optimistic. But Longfellow sort of saw this war coming. I think in some of his earlier poems, he writes, in particular when he writes about the midnight ride of Paul Revere, he seems to give this exhortation at the end, encouraging people to, we're going to have to step up. We're going to be in another hour of great need for our country. Are you going to rise to the occasion or not? He talks about the building of the ship, the ship of state, and he praises the United States, says it is worth protecting and holding on to and preserving, and we don't just bail, we don't just leave. Obviously Longfellow, he was not a warlike, war-hawkish person, but very much convinced that the South was in the wrong to secede from the United States. But at his core, Longfellow wanted to see peace. He wanted to see things healed. He wrote in his diary, just a few years after the war, he says, I have only one desire, and that is for harmony and a frank and honest understanding between North and South. And so when we talk about Longfellow, he was a professor of languages. He marries fairly early on, and he's traveling through Europe practicing different languages that he's going to be teaching. His first wife dies. I think she suffers a bad miscarriage, doesn't respond well to this, and she gets sick and she dies. Longfellow returns home. He's devastated. He's heartbroken. He's been writing poems for a while. He started at a very young age in local newspapers. They're not his best work, his earliest poems, but he gets better, like we all do, as he goes on. But he marries his second wife, Frances. He marries her, and sort of this really helps his career. It seems like being a family man, settling down with a wonderful lady, raising a couple of kids, that seems to do wonders for Longfellow's career. And he writes some of his best poems just sort of with that life inspiring him, motivating him. Like we said, he's a professor of languages. I believe he was a professor at Harvard. And he spends a lot of his time teaching. He spends some of his time writing, and eventually he gets to the point where he would rather spend time with his wife and family and writing poetry than teaching. And he's written some really famous, well-loved poems and even some books. His long-form poems like Evangeline and what was it called? The Song of Hiawatha. Yeah. He's able to sort of make enough money off of poetry to make it's not his side gig anymore. It becomes his full-time work, and so this is what he spends his time doing. Unfortunately, in 1861, not only does the Civil War break out, but in July of that year, Longfellow's wife, his second wife, dies. She is melting some wax, trying to seal, I believe you said it was...
some locks of her daughter's hair, interestingly.
Yes, yeah, trying to put those, I think, in an envelope or something, and, it's an accident, but she is badly burned. Longfellow himself tries to put out his wife, and you can imagine, this is, I'm sure she's in the next room. She's probably screaming. This is not a fun thing to be burning to death. He attempts to put the fire out. He attempts to smother the fire using his own body. He is badly burned himself in the process, but unfortunately his wife succumbs to her wounds. Longfellow himself would be scarred by this incident, not just emotionally, losing his beloved wife, his muse. His world comes crashing down with her death, but also physically he is scarred and injured. You may notice if you look at portraits of Longfellow as a younger man, he's clean shaven. The older he gets, he begins to grow this big bushy beard that sort of is iconic for him and for a few other poets as well, with these big old bushy beards. But Longfellow grows his out of necessity. His skin is so badly damaged from these flames that he can't even shave.
I always thought he just had a cool beard. Oh, man.
Well, it looks cool, but I would imagine that, it also might help to not be able to see those scars in your reflection every day. Just another reminder of what you've lost. And so, with the outbreak of the Civil War, obviously this causes a lot of stress and anxiety in Longfellow, but compounded by the loss of his wife. Just 2 years later, though, it seems like tragedy is always dogging Longfellow, at least for a few years here. His son, in 1863, his son, without Longfellow's permission, runs away, joins the Union Army, serves in the cavalry. Once he's in, he's in. You don't just get to leave because you didn't get your dad's permission. He was of age, and he's serving in the cavalry. He gets sick, he gets malaria, thankfully recovers. But in November of 1863, in a skirmish, in the fighting, he is shot in the back. According to what I was able to read about the incident, he was shot, it went through his back, and sort of, imagine you're hunched over riding a horse trying to dodge bullets like this. So it enters into his back, goes out through the top of his shoulder, and nicks his spine. So this is a serious, life-threatening injury. Nobody knows if he's going to make it. Longfellow gets word of this, rushes to Washington, D.C., and it's just sort of touch and go. You don't really know what's going to happen. They leave to go home on December the 8th. So right before, this Christmas time.
So he's going home, which means he's going to be all right? I mean, he's not in the hospital anymore? He's going to be okay now?
Yeah, today we tend to think that, if you're being discharged from the hospital, you may not be completely done healing, but you're out of the woods. This is not the case. We're in the middle of the Civil War. People don't just convalesce in hospitals, especially back then. They don't know as much about that in medicine. They also don't have the beds. You can imagine when you're in the middle of the Civil War, fighting in and around Washington, D.C., there's a lot of fighting going on around there, and you just don't have the hospital beds. And so most soldiers would be sent either home to convalesce, if it's a minor injury that you can recover from quickly, but, Charles, Longfellow's son, Charles's war is over by this point. You're not going to recover and be able to join the fighting. So he's discharged and sent home to recover. And that's where sort of Longfellow is. He writes this poem that same year in 1863 while his son is recovering, hopefully, from this injury. But like you said, this is not the kind of thing where you get discharged and you're out of the woods. People died all the time in recovery, and injuries like this one, especially these major, war wounds, could get infected. You could have all sorts of complications come up, and there were people who, limped along for a year or two and then died. There are people who, live a few more months and then die. It is nowhere near a sure thing at this point. So it's with that in mind that we sort of come to this poem, and we can see sort of what Longfellow is doing here. Before we get into the poem itself, let's just talk about the bells real quick. And so, my parents have this awesome grandfather clock. It will chime every hour on the hour, and it will count the hours. In life, pre-industrial revolution, when you have cheap, easily affordable things like watches and clocks. Only the wealthy are able to own these things. They're not easy to make, especially if you're making them by hand. They're expensive. They got to be maintained. And so most people, to tell time, depended on church bells. The bells would ring every hour. This is still a thing in Europe and other places. It's just tradition. The bells ring every hour. The bells are also rung on major holidays to announce news, to give you warning if you're about to be attacked, or a war is about to break out, or maybe the war is over. You have the bells. And so bells are part of this community life. So when Longfellow writes the poem about the bells, I think we tend to think of them like sleigh bells or jingle bells. It's not that kind of bells. We're not talking about, tiny little Christmas bells. We're talking about the church bells. And he kind of gives some hints to that as well in the, he talks about the belfries of Christendom and whatnot. But anyway, just want to make sure we understand that as we look into this poem. So Sean, what are some of the things just in the language or the structure of this poem that stick out to you?
The bells in particular, and I love that you touched on that, because I think it was interesting that Longfellow picked those. Like you said, this was one of the few instruments that more than just making music, it sends a message. You can actually use it to communicate, and that's what he's having the bells do in this. So when he talks about wild and sweet, it's like, okay, that makes sense to me. As I thought about it, you realize, this is an instrument that's a hunk of metal swinging through the air and hitting another hunk of metal. There's some wildness to that, and yet there's a sweetness that's conveyed by it. This is musical, but it's a very aggressive musicality. I love that. And then even the way he talks about how the bells work, just as you were saying, it marks time. So it talks about till ringing, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day. So throughout this Christmas day, throughout the Western world, Christendom, these bells are, in a sense, marking that passage of time. And I love that he works that language in, the reality of the bells. All right, they're sending this message. They're creating this environment. Peace on earth, goodwill to men.
Yeah, and of course, if you're listening to the poem earlier, you probably noticed that refrain. It happens at the end of every verse, right? Peace on earth, goodwill to men. Peace on earth, goodwill to men. I like what he talks about here. He talks about the belfries. He talks about the bells being rung, the voice, the chime, the chant sublime. Just this side of heaven, right? It's idyllic. It's peaceful. It sounds a lot like the Americana that Longfellow writes in his poems. It's just sort of this picture of small town, good, honest, America. But then things sort of take a really sharp left turn. He talks about these bells, but he's going to introduce a new voice here, and he talks about the cannons, right? He talks about the bells are not being heard now. You have the cannons being the predominant voice that are being heard in this poem. So what did you think about that?
I really thought that was one of the moments in this poem that we see Longfellow's skill as a poet, because as you were saying, he had created an almost hypnotic feel with that first part of the poem, the rhythm of it, talking about sublime and the beauty of it, and then he really shatters it with these lines, from each black accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south. Those are some harsh words. You talk about an earthquake, that he brings home the reality that he experienced of the very good life turning into the very bad life, and the reality that the country was experiencing of, we're all basically on the same page here, and now we're fighting one another. Reality has ripped apart everyone's image of how things are basically all good. And he just hits that really hard and brings it home in a way that I like.
Yeah, and you were saying something earlier I really like. This is all happening in the shadow of these church bells, right? The belfry is the tower. They're ringing the bells. These churches, this Christendom. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that, in like the Sermon on the Mount, for example, Jesus will say things like, "You have heard it said, but I'm saying to you," we're not going this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but you're going to turn the other cheek. You have this this church, this gospel of peace on earth, goodwill to men, right? That's what we're supposed to be about. And it's in the shadow of all of this that things come apart. You had a nation who you thought could be unified in this idea, this sort of out of the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. There's a lot of this religious zeal in America, and people take their faith pretty seriously, especially in Massachusetts, or around where Longfellow is living and working. To have all of this happening in the shadow of these churches is just pretty telling, I think.
Yeah, no, you're right. I did have a question for you about the language here, and this is one of my favorite things that you do is explaining word that might not understand. When it says the earthquake rent the hearthstones, is the earthquake getting a room with the hearthstones?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question on behalf of our listeners, Sean. No, so, we talk about paying rent. You're talking about... you don't own something, you're paying for the privilege of living there or using it. Rent can also mean to tear. So to say that something, if you rend, to be rent limb from limb would be like to tear something apart. And that's what he's talking about. The hearthstones, the hearth is being cracked and torn apart. You think about an earthquake, and then, everybody's seen these on TV. You see the crack start to form in the bridge, and then it starts to spread out everywhere. And that's what he's sort of painting that picture there, being rent.
So he's saying these households that have been raised with the idea of peace on earth, goodwill to men, are literally being ripped apart across this country that was supposed to be held together by these bonds of shared belief and culture.
Yes, yeah, literally and figuratively. I mean, war is violent enough on its own, but then you have families. This is the famous thing about the Civil War, that you have families who are fighting on opposite sides of battlefields. Husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, uncles, cousins, all going north or south, depending on where they feel like their allegiances should lie. It's sort of, that's the backdrop here that he's putting this poem in. He's writing it in a particular context of war. And I think that, if you listen to the Christmas carols, you don't get the verses about the cannons and the earthquakes. They kind of leave that out. One other thing I think it's important to mention here, that Longfellow himself is not writing about this as a sort of observer of war, but as someone who is suffering, not just his country being torn apart, but his own family. His son is recovering in his home when he's writing this poem, not sure if he's going to live or die. And Sean, I think you were saying this earlier. It's that sort of thing that makes a poem like this kind of pop for us, that makes it something we, at least with this podcast anyway, that we like, because there's something a little bit personal there.
When you're absolutely right, in that very next stanza, when he says, in despair, I bowed my head. This is the point where we actually meet the narrator. He himself is saying, I'm in despair. This is where I'm at. Reality has crashed into my beautiful picture, and these bells, I think you made this point earlier, reality is making a mockery of what the bells are saying. And this is my reality.
Yeah, and that sort of personal touch that a man who's already lost his wife, and then, to be on the brink of losing his son. Again, we know how the story ends. Longfellow's son does recover from his wounds and lives many more years. But at the time this is being written, Longfellow didn't know that. And so it's a very poignant part of the story that you may not get otherwise. So we have hate is strong. The song about peace on earth, goodwill to men, has been mocked. We've made this harsh left turn with the cannons, but we're about to course correct and go back. So what do you think about that last stanza, Sean?
Man, and I love that you made that point with the bells and the cannons, because we actually do have sort of a conversation that's been set up here between two non-human objects. So the bells have spoken, the cannons have responded, and as he said, the cannons have drowned out sound. We don't even hear about the bells for a while in here. But the bells are about to make a return. And just, oh man, there's just such strong language here. It says, then pealed the bells more loud and deep. The bells are not going to let the cannons go unanswered. And they make this claim, and it's such great language, God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. And doth sounds old-fashioned, but if you just said, does he sleep, it doesn't have that force, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail. And so the bells are really making a declaration in the face of the cannons, and that's where we come to an end, with the bells statement, peace on earth, goodwill to men.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Longfellow here makes a couple of references to Scripture. It's not uncommon in a poet like him. When he says that God is not dead, nor doth he sleep, I think he's borrowing directly from Psalm 121. It's the sort of famous Jewish psalm saying, you know, I lift my eyes up to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord. You know, he who watches over Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. You know, I think it says he doth not slumber or sleep. You know, it's that sort of directly borrowing this idea that God is not sleeping. He's still watching over his people. And then, of course, the line about peace on earth and goodwill to men comes directly out of the nativity story. When angels show up in the sky speaking to the shepherds, they bring tidings of good news, of peace on earth and goodwill to men, that God is not angry. You know, normally when angels show up, bad things are going to happen. People get killed. You know, think like the plagues in Egypt. When the angel shows up, firstborns die. But in this case, this is good news that they're getting. This news about peace, goodwill, that God is coming in to intervene in the story. And here, very much when he says that God is not dead, that brings to mind the resurrection of Jesus as well. You know, that he is not here, he is risen just as he said he would. And so there's this sort of hope sprinkled all throughout this poem. And so when we look at it, I think there's just a lot here. It's ripe to look at, to gather things like inspiration and motivation, and talk about what do we take away from this poem? How do we let this poem sort of charge us up? How do we let it impact the way that we live our lives? And so that's kind of what I want to ask you next, Sean. What do you think about this? What are some of the things we can take away from this poem as we go through, you know, our own holiday season?
So I appreciate that, but it's funny, I'm actually going to bounce it back to you a little bit, because one of the best things that you and your wife actually have helped me with in this last year is learning the value of when things are hard, whether the person who's saying it is just saying, oh yeah, things are going to be all right because it hasn't hurt me yet, versus when you are actually going through adversity and still expressing hope. And so I wanted to ask you, I mean, looking at this, couldn't someone, with a lot of authors, make the claim, oh, you're just saying things are going to be all right. You know, we're going to get peace on earth, goodwill to men. It seems like you could ask that question of this poem and of this author if you didn't know anything about it.
Yeah, if you don't know Longfellow's story, like if you don't know that he's lost his first wife, that he lost his second wife 2 years prior, and that his son is on the verge of death, if you don't know that, then sure, you can still read this poem, and it still kind of, you know, it makes a little bit of sense. If you skip the verses about war, it doesn't make as much sense. But even if you don't know Longfellow's story, it makes a little bit of sense. But I think the part of the power of this poem, and the reason that, you know, I think you chose this poem, but you have good taste. You know what we like to do here on this podcast. And so, I think this poem in particular is the kind of poem that we would do here because it is personal. It actually does come from a person who is in the middle of a really tough and difficult and dangerous and uncertain part of his life. And he's able to make this bold statement anyway. For a lot of people, they will say that sort of after the death of his wife and after nearly losing his son, Longfellow's career starts to go on the decline. He writes fewer poems. They're not quite as well received. He's still incredibly popular, but people will say that he's sort of reached the peak of his career, and then he sort of comes down after this. But I think it's kind of hard to blame him. To lose everything that sort of gave you this vitality in life with your wife, your family being, this sort of idyllic view. Obviously, when that goes away, you're going to come down a little bit. But to be able to write this kind of poem sort of at the height of his career, I think it's a testament to Longfellow's faith. I don't know what else to call it. To be able to look and see that, your wife's tombstone is still clean and shiny. You may have to dig another grave for your son any day now. And you put all this right here in the Christmas season, and he doesn't shy away from talking about the hate and the violence, but instead he makes a bold claim that the wrong shall fail. Not just that wrong should fail, but that wrong is going to fail, that right is going to prevail, that peace on earth and goodwill towards men will in fact be our reality. It may not look that way right now, but it will. And it's this testament, this signpost to the world the way that it is going to be.
Absolutely, and I love how you explain that, and that was one of the biggest things that speaks to me about this poem, and I think even inspires me, is the ability to declare that in the face of not yet, where the war's not yet over, my son's not yet recovered, it's one of the things I love about Christmas, that we celebrate the light at the darkest time of year, literally. Darkest time of year, and yet there's a declaration in hope and, as you said, in faith that the light is coming. And I love that. It's like, it's not based on, I've seen that everything's going to get better. It's based on, I believe that it's going to get better because I believe this message of the bells.
Yeah, for sure. As I think about this poem, one of the things that I was listening to Handel's Messiah the other day, and in that beautiful piece of music, so much of the words there come from the Bible. They come from the Old Testament, the New Testament, talking about Jesus, and obviously the piece of music is called Handel's Messiah, so it talks about Jesus as the Messiah. You have these Jewish promises, and then Jesus comes and fulfills them, all of that good stuff. And in Isaiah chapter 9, this is one of the prophecies that Handel references in there, and he has people singing things like, "The people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined." And that's kind of spooky, because that's exactly where Longfellow is. He's in the shadow, the valley of the shadow of death, right there. Literally, his son could die any minute. But he says, "On those people the light has shined, that for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." Even in the middle of a war, to say that the Prince of Peace is going to prevail, that's a big deal. And then, "Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, and upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, to order it and to establish it with judgment and with justice, henceforth, even forever. And so the idea of peace and justice, the idea that the wrong will fail, the right will prevail, this is sort of wrapped up and tied up and woven through the Christmas story. But most of our Christmas carols, and I love this, they're all sort of built around the nativity stories. You have, angels we have heard on high, or oh little town of Bethlehem. It's all about the Christmas story itself. But this Christmas carol isn't about the nativity. It's about American history in a way, but it's become such a popular Christmas carol because the real story of Christmas, at least for the Christian, is not the cutesy little, okay, Jesus was born in the stable and then the wise men came. All that stuff, not that stuff isn't true, but there's a truer story, and the truer story is this one from Isaiah, that God is coming into the world, that righteousness, justice, peace, that those things are being made reality, even in the face of war, that the kingdom of God is coming in on top of the kingdom of the world, and that even in a civil war, even with his son at death's door, Longfellow can see it, and he can see the world not just as it is, or not just as he wants it to be, but as it will be. He has faith to see that things will be a certain way.
And he uses his artistic ability to bring that truth forward for us.
Definitely. Well, I know I asked earlier, what are some of the takeaways? I know that for me, there's a reminder here that whatever we happen to be dealing with, that we have to, even in the darker times, remember our convictions. And so remember those things that give us hope, that bring us peace, and that if we only focus on the cannons, or we only focus on the broken hearthstones, then we miss the reality that the bells are still ringing. And so I think for me, there's a conviction to remember that the bells still ring, and that Christmas is not just to be about a time to spend with family, not just a time to give presents, not just a time to go to church and sing these songs, but it is a time to actually to look at myself and reflect, what is my faith actually in? What do I actually have faith in? Do I believe that the world will be made right? Do I believe that the wrong shall fail, the right will prevail? Do I live like that? Anyway, that's some of the kind of stuff that I take away. What do you take away from this poem, Sean?
I love that, and I definitely agree with that. One of the things that struck me most strongly this time reading it was the bells themselves. And in some ways, I felt an inspiration, kind of a call to us to be like the bells.
Ooh, that's good.
Just as you were saying, to remember those truths, but to also declare them like a bell with love, with empathy, with kindness, but in the face of anger, cynicism, doubt, hatred, fear, to continue to declare what we know is true, that the wrong is going to fail, the right is going to prevail. There will be goodwill, there will be peace, and to not be silenced and shut down, not in the I'm going to get up in your face and yell at you, but to not be so weighed down by despair that we stop standing firm in what we know is true, because there are people that need us to do that. They need us to bring that wild and sweet message to them when they're feeling that weight, when they're in the valley of the shadow of death, and to say, no, look, I am convinced that it is in fact going to get better, that this is where we're going. And so to be like the bells for those that need to hear it. And I think for me it was a personal reminder of, throughout this season, how can I be like that? How can I show goodwill? How can I be a bringer of peace, or, as you've often inspired me, a bringer of justice, to set things that are wrong right in some way? How can I be like a bell in this season?
Oh man, Sean, that is good. I love that. Taking us to church for real here. Yeah, that's so powerful that we can be the bells. And I know, Sean, that your personal convictions and mine, we believe that the Christmas story is true. We believe that, Jesus was born, that he did live, that he was crucified, that he was resurrected. And so we share with Longfellow this hope, this conviction that God is not dead, that he's not sleeping, and that he is bringing his kingdom into the world. But, when we say that this poem is powerful, I think that even for people who don't share those convictions or share that sort of religious significance of a Christmas holiday, that even just in this season, for us to remember that we can not just remember or not just internalize the idea of peace on earth and goodwill to men, but we can actually go be agents of peace and goodwill. And so, whatever that may look like, and people come, like, that's what people do this time of year. They give money, they donate stuff, they feed the hungry, they buy toys for kids who don't have any. Like that is part of, I think, what this season, what so many people love about this season. And so it's with all of that in mind, that we here at the Preaching Poetry Podcast will say Merry Christmas, we'll say Happy Holidays. And yeah, we just want you guys we hope that you have a chance to enjoy the holiday time with family, with friends, but we also know it can be hard. It can be difficult. Holidays are not always times of joy. Sometimes it doesn't feel like you are in a place where there is peace on earth and goodwill to men. We just want to encourage you that even if the holidays are not a happy time, that we can still be those bells. We can still, when we do have that conviction that wrong will fail, that right will prevail, and we can bring peace on earth and goodwill to men. So anyway, Sean, thank you. This has been good, man. Is there anything else that you want to add? Anything else you want to say before we sign off?
I think that sums it up, but I will join in wishing your audience happy holidays and Merry Christmas, and I hope that we all can be bells for someone this season.
That's good. Thank you for listening to the Preaching Poetry Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed your time with us, and we look forward to having you back for more. If you like what you heard, please be sure to leave a review, and don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for more content, you can find us on Apple, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, basically anywhere you find podcasts. If you want to join our community or just want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Preaching Poetry.